Josh, macro being downstream from geopolitics. We've talked about it before, but let me go into detail on this. About 3 days ago, Jeff Snyder did a phenomenal video talking about Xi's action at his swearing-in ceremony, or whatever it was in China. The takeaway was that one of the largest proponents within the government was escorted out of his seat of power, literally right next to Xi. And this was shown externally to the world, but not necessarily internally within China. November 8th, the US will have its next midterm election cycle. And the reason I mention this and how it relates to geopolitics is that if you have an event, and when I say event, basically if you have something that pisses people off, whether it's some sort of geopolitical event, consider what's going on in the Ukraine right now, or some sort of geopolitical / resource / economic
Inflation,
event.
just an event that makes the populace mad.
Exactly. Something that pisses people off. Generally, but not always, the tendency is that would put pressure on the existing leaders in power. Why? Because, oh my goodness, if you're in power, how on earth could you have allowed this to happen? And more importantly, you get people all riled up. You get them all hot and bothered right before an election cycle. Likewise, if you have something that happens right after an election event, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to face as much instability. For example, like in the midterm elections, if you, let's say, have a market crash, just for example, right before, let's say the Friday or Thursday before the midterm election, it's going to dominate the conversation, and it's going to completely change the context of how people, view the situation. Rightly or wrongly, it doesn't matter. The point is, it's going to be the perception of it. However, if you have the same event, so remember, like objectively, save for the date, the same things have happened in this case, some, let's say, major drawdown in the stock market, for example, but it happens after the election. Well, at least from the US perspective, at least the existing leadership structure will have about 2 years in order to try to fix the problem or try to ameliorate whatever the bad, situations are before the next election cycle comes through. The reason I mention all of this is, once again, to illustrate the point of how, even if you're trying to look at the macro situation, and even if you're trying to, be true to your charge and stick only on the macro, it shows how intertwined the political or the geopolitical can be to all of this. Because from the US perspective, if you have, let's say, a geopolitical event that cascades into a political event that then cascades into a financial event. So here's an example of that. You have, say, Japan in desperation trying to defend the currency, dumps a bunch of treasuries to raise dollars to support the yen USD conversion. So for institutions that use treasuries as collateral on the balance sheet, this collateral now has been impaired if you're marking to market. And that's another separate topic of conversation right there. But my point, though, is that in Japan doing something that's very logical, and they're not trying to do shenanigans, or they're not trying to impact, the U.S. elections or anything like that. They're just simply trying to defend the currency peg. But in the process of doing that, if you start triggering this cascade of things where, let's say, you introduce contagion, and then let's say this contagion spills over into the euro, or let's say you've got some large European, Deutsche Bank or Credit Suisse suddenly, starts buckling under pressure again. Or you see, let's say, think earlier today, the Swiss National Banks announced the new swap lines. You see that suddenly spike up. You might have this. You might have this situation that arises where all of a sudden, where a tremendous economic catalyst is now introduced into the system, and if that catalyst does pop off, and if it pops off in a way where it aggravates the American electorate voters before midterms, you might see a major change, or you might see a completely different outcome of that election cycle based upon a short-term thing that happened starting in the macroeconomic world.
We can see that right now.
Back.
Let's use oil. Oil prices are spiking. That causes inflation to go up. What has happened? We see the American voter, they're upset. They're saying, how could you possibly let oil get this expensive? So what does Joe Biden do? He says, okay, we're just going to reduce the SPR, which objectively is not a good thing long term. This is usually a time where we're stockpiling as much oil as possible going into winter. But right now we're running it down to try and reduce gas prices. Yeah. Why is he doing that? Do you think he would be doing this if it was last year and he had an entire year until there was any sort of election? I would probably argue no. And the reason is because he obviously wants the Democrats to stay in power. So he wants them to look as good as humanly possible. Therefore, he's doing something that is irrational. It does not make logical sense for a short-term solution, even if it's going to have a bigger impact on the long term.
Yeah, and this is what I mean when I say, and I think Gammon is very astute to call this out, saying if you're trying to understand the macro picture, you have to wade into the political, even if you're trying to remain neutral. I mean, of course, we all have our political views, nothing wrong with that. But if you're trying to be a macro commentator and strictly comment on the macro, it's very hard, if not impossible, to do that without having to wade into the political. And if you're wading into the political, that is the domestic political. So from us, our perspective as Americans, you wade into the American political scene, but then you've got to wade into the international political scene, the geopolitics of the situation. So anyways, just kind of the reason I mention this is that, again, I find this to be a very interesting phrase. The other thing I'll note too, and this is kind of me putting on my tinfoil, conspiracy hat here, is with Xi basically being cemented into power and a lot of the other usual suspects being put into power and the U.S. facing an election coming up, I'm very curious to see how this cycle plays out. I don't know how to handicap this in the scheme of things. When I say handicap, okay, Justin, great. You've convinced me, whatever, right? Do I buy calls or do I buy puts, and on what, right? Like that's philosophy is fun to talk about, but it still doesn't change the fact that rent's still due at the first of the month. So from an investing perspective, generally I've been favoring straddles for that, and I'm pretty quick to close out the call side of the straddle, but I'll let the put side linger on a little bit more. And as I said, I finally sort of taking my own advice, and I buy plenty of theta on these when I go into them. But that's kind of just some thoughts that I had, and just kind of showing how macro will always be downstream from geopolitical, and sometimes we have these feedback loops where something starts in geopolitical, cascades all the way down through macro, and then the macro thing will cascade back up the chain into geopolitical by skewing, changing, or otherwise promoting an alternate outcome to an election cycle due to some short-term economic factor that might be transitory. I know, transitory, but it's enough to move the needle at that time in that place amongst the voting public.
Thank you, and we'll see you in the next